my sister and I had gotten old enough to grow up and leave home, my mother started a new tradition. And that was that on Christmas Eve, she would go out shopping. My mother would have most of her shopping done prior to that, but she would save a few things that she was pretty sure that she could get at the last minute. And finally I said, Mother, why do you do that? Christmas Eve is crazy out there. And she said, I know, that's why I go. She wanted to be out in the excitement and the anticipation and what was taking place on that Christmas Eve. Well, that excitement and anticipation and all that craziness is what we have in that first Christmas night in Bethlehem. We had Bedlam. That craziness, that lots of excitement and people pushing and shoving and people looking and trying to find bargains. And in Bethlehem, that first Christmas night, the people were there, hundreds if not thousands, had gone to Bethlehem to be counted as a part of the census that was demanded by Caesar Augustus. And so the people that from Bethlehem had gone there, and so they were trying to find places to sleep and food to eat and places to put their animals. And so there was great bedlam, great chaos going on there. And it's there in the midst of that the Christmas story takes place. Our theme for this Christmas is finding Bethlehem in the midst of bedlam. Finding Bethlehem in the midst of bedlam. Because the truth is that our world is just as chaotic as it was that first night in Bethlehem. With all of our shopping and wrapping and cooking and cleaning and decorating and putting up the tree and doing all the holiday things that we do. Somebody had on Facebook yesterday that they had their first of 5 trees up and decorated. I used to do that. Now I'm lucky if I get 1 tree up. And maybe even decorate it sometimes. It depends. But in the midst of that and all of that chaos, that's when God breaks in. God broke into Bethlehem in the midst of all the confusion that was taking place. Because God knew that to wait until we were ready for God, God would never come. Because there's always something else that we need to do. There are many people who say, oh, I have this and this and this to do, and I hope I get it all done before Christmas. And I often will remind them, well, if you don't, Christmas will still come. Thank God that Christmas doesn't depend necessarily upon our being ready. For God breaks into whatever's happening in our lives. God breaks into the midst of all the turmoil that's going on and all the excitement. And a lot of it's exciting and fun. You know, I was one of 13 grandchildren. My mother was one of 6. And there was a day when we would all go to Grandma's at the same time. So there would be 14 adults and the 13 grandchildren. And it would get pretty chaotic, as you can imagine, as we were all running around and having a great time. And often the aunts would say, be quiet, you're giving Grandma a headache. Well, the truth was, Grandma was the one who was stirring us all up. Grandma had a great time with all the grandchildren. It was the mothers who were getting a headache. And I had to laugh because on the day after Thanksgiving, my sister and brother-in-law and I were engaged in our yearly ritual. And that is that we bake all of our Christmas cookies together on that day. Now, since my brother-in-law retired, and he was a chef at one point, he mixes up all the cookie dough on Wednesday. So on Friday morning, we can get an early start and start making those cookies. Well, my sister's older son and his 2 children, who are 8 and 9, were with us that day, and the kids were getting a little bored and they were running around through the house. And Cindy said at one point, quiet, quiet, you're giving Grandma a headache. And it was her, and she did have a headache. But it's in the midst of all of that chaos and the fun and the excitement that God breaks in. God comes to us. And so our scripture this morning talks about the angels being God's messengers coming to the shepherds outside on the hills of Bethlehem. And the angels come to those shepherds, and we have this wonderful pastoral image of the shepherds being, you know, the quiet, and it's very calm, and the sheep are all sleeping, and the shepherds are standing around sleeping on their crooks maybe, and dressed in their father's bathrobes. And well, that's at the Christmas program, right? Right. They have on their robes, and it looks very nice and stunning. But the truth is that the shepherds who were out in the fields that night were the lowest class of shepherds. They weren't the owners of the big flocks of sheep, but they were what were really considered the unreliable shepherds. They were the ones who were shunned because they tended to graze their flocks on land that belonged to somebody else. And in fact, most people thought of them, as some countries do today, of the gypsies, who were the vagrants and who were the scallywags. But it's those folks, those shepherds, that God first tells the good news. Well, this angel appears to them. Now imagine you're out on the hillside, and there's your sheep and your friends, and you're just kind of hanging out there, and this bright light comes with an angel. The angel said, "Do not be afraid." I think most of us would be frightened. I would be. My mother always said there's a difference between being afraid and being startled. I think I would have been startled, and then I would have been afraid that this angel had appeared to us. And the angel said, "Do not be afraid. For behold, I tell you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. Unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." A message of great joy, of good news. Deb said that we were reading today from the Gospel of St. Luke. Gospel meaning good news. And the good news, the word that's translated there as good news, is a word that was used by the Roman government or the Roman armies in their telling of their story. Remember, the nation of Rome, the Roman Empire had taken over the nation of Israel at this point and was occupying Israel. And so the people of Israel were used to the parades of the Roman armies. And the parades kind of told a story. They began with the limited kind of battles and victories that they had won, and they continued to build up and up and up until the last victory, the greatest victory. And that was the good news, the greatest victory. And that's the term that the writer of Luke uses to convey that the news of Jesus' birth is that greatest victory, that greatest example of God's power and might. So here are these shepherds who are kind of shunned by the rest of society. They've got the late night watch, and they're out there in their fields. And the angel says to them, "Don't be afraid, because we have really good news for you." He tells them that story. That's God breaking into the very midst of their lives, breaking into all the chaos that was going on in Bethlehem and telling that story. That even in the craziness of our lives, God still comes and breaks in and reminds us of God's presence. Why did Jesus come? Well, Jesus came first of all to show us who God is. To show us in His life and in His teachings and in His works that God is God of love. God is love. That doesn't sound surprising to us because we're used to that. We're used to hearing that. But in those ancient days, they were afraid of God. Because they were taught that to be in God's presence was to be dead. Because God was so other, God was so holy, that you didn't want to be in God's presence because it would be so overwhelming, you would die. You remember that the temple was built squares within squares within squares, and in the very middle of that temple was the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies was kept the Ark of the Covenant, a chest. And in the Ark of the Covenant were the Ten Commandments, the tablets of stone. And the ancient Israelites believed that God lived in that Holy of Holies. And it was so special that only the high priest, and only one day of the year, did the high priest go into God's presence. But now Jesus comes and says, "Do not be afraid." The angel said, "For this is good news. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to fear God, because God is love." When we find Bethlehem in the midst of Bedlam, we find that God is love and what God is like and who God is, the God that we worship. In Jesus' coming, not only did he show us who God is, but he showed us who we are. For in his living, he showed us how we are to live as children of God. For we are to imitate him. We are to be like him. Christian means like Christ. And so we are taught to be like Christ, to live as he lived, and to be God's presence in this world. And Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I love you. Therefore, love one another. Because the truth is, we show our love for God and how we treat one another. We show our love for God by how we treat God's children, how we interact with one another. And again, we look at the example of Christ and how he interacted with the people and how he invited everyone to come and to be a part of God's family. From the lowliest shepherds to the prostitutes and tax collectors and all the sinners and outcasts, God invites them to come in Jesus Christ. And so we are called to invite them to come. God's talked about the 150 people that came here to eat Thanksgiving dinner, and many of those folks did not have a place to go. It's either they're estranged from their families, or they have no families or friends in this area, or whatever the reason is, they had a place to come and to be a part of that dinner. That's being Christ in this community. That's being Christ in this world. Inviting anyone who wants to come and eat, to come and be a part. And that's how we find Bethlehem in the midst of Bedlam when we try to live as Christ lived. And we find Bethlehem in the midst of Bedlam when we begin to get our priorities straight. Anybody ever say that to your kids? You need to get your priorities straight. Anybody ever told you that? Probably somewhere along the way. There are a multitude of Christmas stories that make that point. From A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens to the O. Henry short story about the gift of the Magi. But the author of the book that we're using this Advent, which is called When Finding Bethlehem in the Midst of Bedlam, tells a story that he learned a long time ago. There was a man named Jack Smith who was a member of a congregation, and his pastor assigned him to go to the home of a family where the father had been out of work for a long time. And he was to take the two young boys shopping for Christmas. Now you know it was a long time ago because he gave each boy $4. And they thought that was a lot. So 9-year-old Timmy and 7-year-old Billy went with Mr. Smith to go shopping, and Mr. Smith wasn't sure, so he took them to a toy store, and they looked around, and they said no, there wasn't anything they wanted. And he said, are you sure? They tried to steer him, and they said no. So he took them to a hobby shop, and they looked at the things there, and again, there was nothing that they wanted. And he tried a candy store and a clothing store, and this was, remember, we didn't have Walmart, we had all those individual stores. And finally he said to the boys, well, where do you want to go? And they said, we want to go to a shoe store. And when they got to the shoe store, Timmy pulled out of his pocket a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper was a tracing of the outline of their father's foot that they had traced while he slept. And they took it out and said to the shopkeeper, do you have a pair of shoes that would fit these people? The shopkeeper looked around and he found a pair of shoes and he brought them down. And he said, yes, look, these fit perfectly. And the boys were all excited until Timmy saw the price. And it was $15.95. This is a story from a long time ago. Timmy said to Billy, we can't buy this. We don't have enough money. And the shopkeeper, realizing what was going on, said, but you know what? Today they're on special. They're only $5.95. And so Billy and Timmy were able to buy that pair of shoes for their father. And had some money left over to buy something for their mother and their two sisters. Jack Smith was really touched by that experience. And a few days later, he saw Billy and Tommy's father out on the street, and he said to them, Mr. Smith, the man said to Mr. Smith and thanked him for taking his sons out shopping and said how much they appreciated that and how much they learned from him. And Jack Smith said, no, I'm the one that learned. I'm the one that learned what it means to have your priorities, to be thinking about others. We find Bethlehem in the midst of Bedlam. When we, like the shepherds, have our ears open, our eyes open, and our hearts open to receive the good news.